Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, the president heads to Scotland with just 1 week until the tariff deadline.
I'll be meeting with the EU on Sunday, and we'll be working on a deal. We'll see if we make a deal. Ursula will be here, highly respected woman, so we look forward to that.
Trump landing in Scotland just a short time ago, now set to meet with the president of the European Commission as both the U.S. and EU try to hammer out a trade agreement with only 6 days to the deadline. By then, we'll dive into specifics of what's being discussed with our Washington team.
Plus, a look at the humanitarian crisis on the ground in Gaza as global leaders call for a ceasefire after the U.S. and Israel pulled out of negotiations and accused Hamas of acting in bad faith.
And a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell. News from the White House on what the president thinks about a possible pardon or commutation for the Epstein accomplice as the DOJ today meets with the convicted sex trafficker for a second consecutive day. But we begin tonight with the impending trade deadline as the president arrives in Scotland. The president telling reporters today he expects to meet with the heads of state and business leaders in his 5-day trip. Among them, the UK's Keir Starmer and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. This morning, before boarding his flight to Scotland, the president shared what he sees as the odds of the U.S. and EU striking a trade deal.
I would say that we have a 50-50 chance, maybe less than that, but a 50-50 chance of making a deal with the EU. And it'll be a deal where they have to buy down their tariffs, because they're right now at 30%. And they'll have to buy them down, maybe, or they could leave them the way they are. But they want to make a deal very badly. I would have said we have a 25% chance with Japan, and they kept coming back and we made a deal.
Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy, we know that the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is going to meet with President Trump this weekend. Relatively, the EU seems to have sort of reversed its favor. It's moved up in line when it comes to a trade deal. Should we see this as progress? How close are we to an actual framework being announced?
Well, it's hard to tell, and I think part of what the president was doing there was a little expectation setting. You know, they if Ursula von der Leyen, who he described as a well-respected woman, which is, you know, a good thing for Trump to say ahead of the meeting, you know, she's coming there. She wouldn't bother coming unless they thought they were close. Now, he also said there were about 20 sticking points, but they are going through sectoral tariffs, what to do with steel and aluminum, what to do with auto manufacturing and things like that. So there are some sticking points to work out, but that won't happen at the von der Leyen-Trump level. I mean, they're going to agree to the framework of a deal that will hold off on those reciprocal tariffs and allow the more detailed talks to come forward.
I wonder what kind of a reception he gets in that room, Wendy. We asked Peter Navarro just a couple of days ago at this table, if they land a deal with the EU, maybe another with, say, South Korea, do we just walk away and say April 1st remains the deadline, everybody else starts paying based on the letter that you received? Or does that date move again for those who are in talks with the White House? Well, he wouldn't answer. He said it's up to the boss, Wendy.
Well, like in this administration, everything's up to the boss, right? But he did also say, the president said at some point today that some of these deals are just going to be the letters I send out, instructing you what your tariffs are from now on. So it could be that he gets a few more, you know, marquee ones like the EU, UK, South Korea under his belt, and then just says, the heck with it, I'm just going to send letters out, and this is the way it is. But those also open the door to more negotiations. I think if a leader came back and said, yeah, I got your letter, but, you know, let's talk about aluminum, then he might push things back a little bit. Sure. These deadlines with Trump have been very, very fluid.
Well, Wendy, let's just stick on trade for a minute here. And what sort of deals are we still waiting for? We know the EU, we know South Korea. What are some of the other trading partners that we've yet to hear from, but that perhaps were prioritized leading up to this?
Well, at the moment, Canada is a really big sticking point. And I think they even said today or yesterday, in the last 48 hours or so, someone has said, we're not in Canada, we're not going to be able to make a deal with this guy. It's just, you know, it's not going to work out. which also may be a negotiating position. But remember, he has set tariffs on every spot on the planet, including, remember the islands with only penguins on them, that they have tariffs too. So, there's so many more deals to be made and negotiated. The Filipino president was just in. They still are working on, I think, that deal. So, there's a whole planet to go through.
Well, the president is heading abroad, and this whole trade story is unfolding as we follow developments as on the issue that's still dogging the president on his way to Scotland after Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche met with Jeffrey Epstein accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell for a second day. The president was asked about it on his way out this morning, and this is happening as we get new polling on the issue, with a new Reuters poll showing only 17% of the public approves of the president's handling of this issue.
And as the president heads to Scotland, now lands in Scotland, it seems that the issue could be following him. Images of the president with Epstein have been posted across the UK. This morning, as the president was preparing to leave the White House, he had this to say about an alleged birthday card that he sent to Epstein.
I don't even know what they're talking about. Now, somebody could have written a letter and used my name, but that's happened a lot. All you have to do is take a look at the dossier, the fake dossier. Everything's fake with that administration. Everything's fake with the Democrats.
So, Wendy, we mentioned some polling there when it comes to the Epstein issue. We also had polling today from the Wall Street Journal that 88% of Republican voters actually approve of President Trump's performance. He seems to be doing well when it comes to the base. But how could this issue perhaps divide his base, or how are we seeing it?
Well, the polling is showing that it is pulling away. There is the beginning of a fracturing in that incredibly solid base that he has enjoyed through both terms so far. And there has never been a crack in that. And there was another poll in the New York Times that showed that 36% of Republicans disapprove of the way he is handling the Epstein story, which is remarkably high for his own party, for this president. Other presidents have had people in their own party, I would think Joe Biden included, who their own party is upset with their performance. For Trump, that has never happened. And for a third of Republicans to be upset with the way he's handling this is remarkable. And he was asked about Ghislaine Maxwell and the pardon. And he said, well, I have the power to do it, but I haven't decided whether to do it. I'm not sure how that's going to play with his base. If he pardons her, it will be because it depends on what he made it clear that it depends on what she says to Todd Blanche, who interviewed her, several times today. So this story is not going away, unfortunately, and those images of what's greeting him at bus stops in Scotland are going to be irking him, I'm sure. He
spent most of his time pointing to Bill Clinton when he was asked those questions.
And
Wendy,
Bill Clinton today said, go ahead and release the files. I don't care.
This could get a lot more interesting, couldn't it? Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much for the insights. Joining us now for more on how Republicans are navigating the division surrounding the release of the Epstein files, but also what awaits lawmakers on August recess and a number of other issues. Marc Short, former chief of staff for Vice President Mike Pence, Republican strategist. Marc, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Sure,
thanks for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm curious about the potential distraction. We're not going to solve this issue with the Epstein files tonight, but lawmakers in the House ended up going home early because of this. And there's a very closed, short period of time, I should say, when they returned to get a budget done. This is going to be looming over the hill when they return. How much does this affect business?
I think it's going to affect it significantly, Joe. I think the reality is that probably there was a sense in some in the White House that felt like we avoided having a vote on this prior to the August recess. And so it buys us time. It maybe buys them time, but I'm not sure it goes away. I think the reality is when members are back in their districts, they're going to continue to hear from their constituents because this has been a white-hot issue for Republicans. And I think, it's important to remember that many of the most conservative influencers on the right were ginning up the story about, some sort of more nefarious details of prominent Democrats who were caught up in this scandal, and they expect it to come out. And so I think that you're going to see more actually Republicans sign on to the discharge petition, forcing the hand of the Speaker to have a vote on this.
Do you think, though, that this risks perhaps the appropriations process? Is this going to take up so much room when lawmakers do get back that we could be looking at this showdown headed when it comes to the fall?
Well, Tyler, I'm pretty cynical on the appropriations process in general. We haven't actually had Congress complete its appropriations bills on time since the Bill Clinton era. And so I would imagine you're going to have a continuing resolution. I'm not one who believes we actually have as high a risk of a shutdown. The early numbers from Democrats, Republicans in the White House are pretty close. But I think what you're just going to see is this punted to the end of the year and avoid a shutdown for now.
So no shutdown. Good for President Trump, but there are other matters at hand. We've talked a lot recently about rescissions. We were promised another one if the last one passed. Yeah. Not to mention the potential for another reconciliation bill. Not to get too overboard here. Would there be another rescissions package? Because this is what sent Democrats to the Hills, saying we're going to shut it down.
I think that there could be another rescissions package at some point later in the fall. I would imagine it's after the September 30th vote for a continuing resolution. But I also think the White House is looking to have a fight with Congress on the Impoundment Act. And so I think they're wanting to bait having a rescissions package that actually fails. So then they can say, see, Congress isn't serious about this. We just have to impound the funds and set up a legal battle for later in the year.
That is actually really interesting because we've actually spoken to some Republicans who say that they don't want to see another rescissions package. And this idea, I'd love your take, that Congress is giving up its power of the purse here instead of working with the administration perhaps on another priority to get done.
Well, Tyler, look, Congress has already given up its ability to tax the American people with the trade policy of the current administration. And I think that is something that the Constitution very clearly rests in the legislative branch. And so there's a lot of things that they have been giving up lately. But I also think that the rescissions package that passed was really the smallest of small. It was the most narrow thing that they could do. So I think the fact if you have a second one, I do think the chances of it passing are much less than the first one.
I want to ask you about tariff checks, the idea of rebate checks going out. The president was asked about it this morning. Josh Hawley followed up with legislation. Let's start with what the president said on his way out of the White House to Scotland.
We have so much money coming in. We're thinking about a little rebate, but the big thing we want to do is pay down debt. But we're thinking about a rebate. That's a very good question. You just made a lot of news. We're thinking about a rebate because we have so much money coming in from tariffs that a little rebate for people of a certain income level might be very nice.
Okay, a little rebate, he says. Just like that, Senator Josh Hawley's office puts out a tweet, Hawley to introduce legislation sending rebate check to every working American. You see it on Bloomberg TV and YouTube, saying that he will introduce such legislation. For Mark, every working person in America, isn't this what Republicans criticized Joe Biden for 2 years?
Yeah, Joe, I've never seen a Republican administration with so many central planners in their economics department. I think it's amazing to see that you said this is basically the policies of the Democrats, which you've seen in the last couple of years. The Republicans advanced legislation to raise the federal minimum wage. You've seen Republicans embrace more regulations. And so I think it reflects the dramatic shift economic in the Republican Party. I think rather than sending rebate checks, it's important to remind people that the money rolling into the Treasury is a tax on the American people. It's not a foreign government paying the tariff. It's American citizens paying the tariff. So rather than giving a rebate check, one thing to do would actually be to lower the tariffs, if that's what they want to do to provide help for working families.
Wow.
Well, let's sort of thread the needle here between perhaps a reconciliation 2.0 package, but then also the idea that tariff revenue is supposed to be helping to pay down what we saw was added when it comes to deficit spending from the first reconciliation package. Can you sort of connect the dots for us here? What are we looking in a reconciliation 2.0? House Speaker Mike Johnson told us this week that they're already starting to work on it. Would it be, significantly adding to the deficit in terms of the types of priorities that might end up getting wrapped into it?
Tyler, I think the talk of a reconciliation package 2.0 is happy talk. I don't think you're going to see that. I think the reality is that the first bill had all the major priorities of both Congress and the administration. And in some ways, when they talk about a second package, they're almost even searching for what they would put in it. So I think that that's one to give prospect and hope for the voters to say we're going to continue working on this. I don't think you're going to see one.
I want to ask you quickly about the president's trip to the Fed yesterday while you're with us, as someone who's a bit more financially minded than some in Washington. This power play by the president is going to result apparently in very little. He's not going to get fired.
Sure.
He's not going to step down. Nobody expects the Fed to cut interest rates next week. What's Donald Trump doing?
Well, I guess I have a little different perspective. I can't
wait to hear it.
Well, I think for the president, he views this as a no-lose situation. As you said, it's a small chance, but either A, Powell actually concedes and lowers rates, which is what Trump wants. B, Powell gets tired of this and quits, which Trump would be fine with, too. C, if actually the tariff policy begins to have a negative impact on the economy in the second half of the year, he has an out to blame. C, I told the Fed that she was lowering rates, so it's the Fed's fault. And D, Joe, this basically is basically a signal he's setting up for whoever succeeds Powell. Whoever succeeds Powell, he's sending a clear message like, I'm going to make your life hell or you're going to lower rates. And so for him, I think it's a no-lose situation for the president.
Fascinating. It's almost like you worked with him. Marc Short, great to have you back, Marc. Thank you. The former Chief of Staff, Vice President Mike Pence, Republican strategist, with us live in Washington tonight on Bloomberg. I want to mention some breaking news. Just happened a couple of moments ago. A federal judge in Boston issuing the second nationwide block of the president's birthright citizenship limits this month, as lawsuits continue, seen as another sign that a recent Supreme Court decision restricting universal injunctions is having a limited impact on this issue. And we'll bring you any reaction that we get straight ahead from the president.
And coming up, European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen will travel to Scotland to meet with President Trump as the EU tries to clinch a trade deal before the August 1st deadline. But first, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza as the U.S. and Israel withdraw negotiating teams from Qatar, with the Trump administration saying Hamas is not acting in good faith. We'll discuss what's next for Gaza with Ciarán Donnelly, head of the international programs at the IRC, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. I think they want to die, and it's very, very bad. Are you done? And it got to be to a point where you're going to have to finish the job. So they pulled out, and they're going to have to fight, and they're going to have to clean it up. You're going to have to get rid of it.
President Trump commenting this morning on the ceasefire talks with Hamas that were cut short after the U.S. and Israel withdrew their negotiating teams from Qatar. They've left the table. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff telling reporters that Hamas, quote, does not appear to be coordinated or acting in good faith, unquote, as a humanitarian crisis unfolds in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's now considering alternative options to deal with the facing blowback, a global blowback, over what NGOs are deeming a mass starvation occurring right now in Gaza. Meantime, France's Emmanuel Macron is moving to recognize a Palestinian state officially, a step unlikely to change the trajectory of the Israel-Hamas war, but one that raises potential pressure on other world leaders to act. Joining us now with that and more is Bloomberg's Magdalena Del Valle, who is live from World Headquarters in New York. Magdalena, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Balance of Power. The president said when asked about Macron today, here's the good news, what he says doesn't matter. What does this move mean for the politics of this war?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I mean, of course, Macron's announcement doesn't mean that there's going to be any immediate action on the ground. We're not going to be seeing a ceasefire tomorrow because he announced that France will be acknowledging Palestine as a sovereign state. However, this is still a very powerful symbol at an extremely critical time. First, because it's bringing people's attention back to Gaza. In recent weeks, humanitarian organizations have been saying that the situation there is worse than ever. People are starving, children are extremely malnourished, and civilians are getting shot on their way to get food. And President Macron is bringing the conversation back to this crisis. The second thing he's doing is he's establishing a tone for a conference that's taking place at the UN next week. It's being co-hosted by France and Saudi Arabia, and their diplomats are set to discuss a two-state solution and next steps for Gaza after a ceasefire is reached. So Saudi Arabia had already acknowledged Palestine should be a sovereign state, but now that France, the other co-host, has done the same, the agenda is kind of set for how the conversations are set to go at this conference. The third thing it does is that it opens the door for others to follow suit, including Keir Starmer, whom Parliament has been pushing to recognize Palestine as a state for a while. And now this is especially important because Starmer is set to meet with Trump next week. And as we know, Trump has Netanyahu's ear. So there are some very possible ripple effects that could come from Macron's announcement yesterday.
All right, Bloomberg's Magdalena Del Valle, we thank you so much for your reporting. Now, some news outlets, including the BBC and AFP, are warning their journalists in Gaza are at risk of starvation. They're calling on Israel to take action beyond the approval of airdropping aid into the conflict zone. That decision from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu comes as headlines pile up about dire conditions. One report from The Guardian reading, quote, skeletal children fill hospital wards as starvation grips Gaza. Israel blames the situation on Hamas, saying the militant group is responsible for any food distribution shortfalls. Now, for more insight, we turn to Ciarán Donnelly, head of the international programs at the IRC, or International Rescue Committee. Ciarán, thanks so much for joining Bloomberg. Can you give us some context here so that we can understand the numbers? How many people in the conflict zone are currently at risk when it does come to starvation?
Thanks for having me on, Tyler. So in Gaza, there are 2.1 million people, and that entire population is classified as what we call acute food insecurity. That means that everyone in Gaza struggles to find food to feed themselves and their family on a daily basis. Now, of the 2.1, 1 million people are at a higher level of food insecurity, and 500,000 of them are classed at the very highest level on the international scale, which is famine-like conditions. Really important to remember, these numbers are a lagging indicator. So they indicate these conditions on the ground at the time the data was collected. The situation on the ground is getting worse day by day. And to put a human face on it, a context to it, the pictures you've shown, the apocalyptic scenarios on the ground, really translate into children, elderly people, even healthy adults who just don't have enough to eat and who are succumbing to acute malnutrition and starvation with deathly effects. And that's going to only continue without rapid and scaled up humanitarian intervention on a level that we haven't seen yet in this war.
Well, Ciarán, we've been talking about this for years, including Joe Biden's efforts to go around the Israelis, our own allies here, by building a pier that didn't turn out to be the most effective experiment. How should we understand this? Is it Israel or Hamas that is most responsible for blocking food to Gaza?
So, look, what I can say is the infrastructure to deliver aid at the volume it's needed to get to the communities who most need it, where they currently are, and to deliver not just food, but specialized services, malnutrition treatment, medical treatment, and so on, and to do all of that in a way which follows the most rigorous processes for ensuring that no party to the conflict benefits from that aid. All of that exists today in the United Nations and in international humanitarian organizations like the IRC. The Israeli government is not allowing us the access and the space to be able to scale up. We have systems to make sure that our aid that we deliver, that we manage, doesn't benefit Hamas or any other party to a conflict. We'll deploy those systems in conflict zones around the world. When we see things like piers, when we see discussions of aid drops, which are in the headlines just today, these things are really distractions. They're never going to allow us to reach the people that need to be reached with the levels of aid, with the types of services they need. What we really need is access on the ground, not airdrops.
Well, Ciarán, just in our final minute here, I was going to follow up on that. What is one action that could be prioritized to help you get aid to the people that need it the most?
We have tons of supplies sitting on the Gaza border, as does every other humanitarian organization working in Gaza. Open the borders, allow our supplies in, create safe conditions on the ground for people to be able to access our services. Open the gates, let aid in. That's what's needed to save lives in Gaza. And I fear there's a terrible catastrophe looming if that doesn't happen.
Ciarán, it's great to have you. We appreciate your insights today. Ciarán Donnelly is head of the international programs at the IRC, the International Rescue Committee. Thank you for being part of Balance of Power this evening. Coming up, we turn to Europe as the EU's Ursula von der Leyen is set to meet President Trump this weekend in a bid to clinch a trade deal ahead of the August 1st deadline, 1 week from today. As President Trump heads to Scotland for the weekend, he's got trade on the agenda, not only with the EU, but also the UK's Keir Starmer. We're going to talk about the implications coming up next on Balance of Power, live from Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio.
August 1st is going to come, and we will have most of our deals finished, if not all. We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs, not really a negotiation. We're working very diligently with Europe, the EU, which covers a lot of territory, a lot of countries, and that's the big one right now. We have the confines of a deal with China.
That's the big one, President Trump says, ahead of boarding his flight to Scotland for the weekend, saying that while the August 1st deadline is rapidly approaching, here we are a week out. He believes many trade deals will be finished in time. And joining us for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Heidi Crebo-Rediker, Senior Fellow in the Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She was the first chief economist in the Obama administration's State Department. And Heidi, it's always great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us here today in Washington. Is there a strategy here for the EU? The president and his advisors, from Peter Navarro to Howard Lutnick to Scott Bessent, we're talking a lot this week about the benefits of Japan and the deals that it could potentially unlock. The EU would be the big one, as the president just mentioned. Could that happen in the next week?
So it could, but I'm not holding my breath. I think as we sort of go barreling towards this August 1st deadline, you have a lot of countries that seem like they're capitulating or they're ready to write checks. And I think the devil's in the details. There's sort of one sense that everyone wants to kind of take the temperature down and make sure that you have some less chaos. But when it comes to the Japan deal, I think even the Japanese are not quite clear what it is they actually agreed to, because they came out today saying, unlike what President Trump said, this is not a $550 billion check that they can just sort of, do a 90-10 split with the Japanese. It really, it is more of a framework. There was no deal signed. There's nothing done.
White House called it a blank check.
I know, a blank check. And I think even, Howard Lutnick said that this could be for nuclear power plants, it could be for fabs, it could be for a whole lot of things. And I think the Japanese are sort of taking a step back and going like, whoa, we actually didn't agree terms. So this is going to be decided by private companies. There's an envelope for loans and loan guarantees, potential equity investments, but those are going to be taken by company decisions with the backing of the Japanese government. But I think they also assumed that the U.S. was going to be contributing as well. So devil is in the details. Trade is very complicated.
Well, especially when you had the administration essentially saying that this innovative fund, in their words, ultimately got the Japan deal over the finish line. But to bring it back to the European Union, we know that these are 27 different member states negotiating. How are we seeing that sort of complicate things as we try to get towards that finish line? And we know that the EU's Commission president is trying to get this done with President Trump over the weekend.
So she will be going to Scotland on Sunday and negotiating, hopefully, what will be a final deal. The EU has come together and agreed that they would be ready to retaliate on August 7th if on August 1st the president moves ahead with full tariffs without having done any negotiations. I think they'd be ready to come down to the 15%. I think that landing zone of 15% is what a lot of countries are assuming they are going to get to. But again, Trump came out and said they need to buy their tariffs down. And I think that means the same thing that the Japanese did in what the Trump administration interpreted, which is write a big fat check. And I don't know how the Europeans do that. 27 member states, and they all have to agree to whatever it is the terms are that are agreed to by Ursula von der Leyen.
It's like paying down points on a mortgage, apparently, is how the trade deals work in this White House. Heidi, I'm curious about this vision of selling GM cars and Fords and Chryslers in places like Europe and Japan. Is this a false promise that we're hearing from the White House, or something that could come from, quote unquote, opening these markets?
So I do think that, the auto issue, first and foremost, to Europe is incredibly, and for Japan as well. They want to have the U.S. market open to their autos. If we are manufacturing very large SUV type vehicles, then they are not as easily marketable in Europe, and certainly not in Japan. So it comes down to the customer demands for certain markets, and so it's really whether the price point hits the right the right market for both Europe or Japan. It's really going to be a consumer decision. And you have to remember, in Europe in particular, they have a huge onslaught of cheap Chinese cars coming into the market. So their own automakers are actually struggling right now to make sure that they can compete.
Well, to follow up on autos, we've really seen sector-specific tariffs come into the conversation in these negotiations in such a significant way. Why is that? Is that because that's where there's perhaps more potency, more leverage for the U.S. on that side, that all of our trading partners really do want to see those carve-outs for some of these key industries?
Yeah, well, I think ideally you'd have you would have carve-outs, but I think at the end of the day, you're going to see a lot of countries just come down to whatever the lowest common denominator they can get to. I mean, Europe's going to push on steel and aluminum, on autos, and on pharma, and I think those are three key areas for the EU. For Japan, it was the rice imports, and that's a deeply divisive political issue in Japan. And at the end of the day, it was while we opened, in theory, up the market for U.S. exports of rice to Japan, you still don't have the sense that the Japanese are ready to just buy unlimited U.S. rice. I mean, it's still going to be a divisive. So you do have certain areas where you're always going to have some friction. But again, these are all really complicated deals to negotiate. And if you have two parties walking away thinking you have a deal and there's a disagreement because there are no details, that's problematic. It means that this tariff war is not going away in the next couple of months. August 1st comes, and then we see actually what we have.
So what's more likely, a trade war with Europe or a deal?
I think it would be hard not to come to a deal eventually with Europe. It's just such an important trading partner for the U.S. I'm actually a little bit more worried about Canada because they are not only our dear neighbor to the north, but they are one of our closest trading partners as well. And their economy is completely tied to exporting to the U.S. And right now, it doesn't seem to be on the president's agenda really at all. He's saying, that the Canada is like at the bottom of the list. And I think that's worrying.
All right. Heidi Crebo-Rediker, Senior Fellow at the Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. We thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you.
And joining us now for a look at the global economic impact to that impending trade deadline on August 1st. We turn now to Megan Schoenberger, Senior Economist at KPMG. Megan, thanks so much for joining. I want to talk about how we're seeing this baseline tariff rate start to shake out, because our understanding and investors' understanding had been that it was going to be at 10%, that was going to be the floor. But we're starting to see things shift up. A lot of nations hovering close to perhaps a 15% tariff rate. Can you just talk to us about where you see this headed when it comes to that global blanket tariff?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one thing that we're seeing with the August 1st deadline is that regardless of the outcome of some of these negotiations, whether they are negotiated or not, is that tariffs will still increase if we look at the EU trade deal. For example, even in the best case scenario, tariffs are still going to increase from 10 to 15% in the best case scenario. So I think it's really important to note that, because one thing that we've noticed is that there are a lot of revenues coming in from tariffs and climbing during the month. And I think the administration is looking at that and thinking about capturing some of those revenues to pay for some of the increases in the deficit in the bill. And so it is a possibility, right, that if a lot of these do get negotiated down, that maybe we even get a higher baseline tariff. And that is something that has been floated by the administration, going from 10 to 15%. But again, I think regardless of the outcome of some of these negotiations, the effective tariff rate on U.S. imports is going to climb. The tax burden on both corporates and households is likely to increase.
Megan, it's an interesting idea as to where this money goes, because now the president's suggesting rebate checks potentially, and we can have a whole other conversation about where that money would be most useful. But what happens if these tariffs start to go away? The more deals we have, potentially the fewer tariffs we have based on what we've seen. And to what extent could this date, a week from today, move?
Well, the up and down is really a big source of the uncertainty that the economy is experiencing. And I think that's really important. And one thing that I talk about with clients is even if the tariffs go away tomorrow, that's still a lot of uncertainty, right? Because it is up and down, and there's not a lot of faith in the direction of tariffs. I think that, again, regardless of negotiations, we're still looking at a higher effective tariff rate by the end of the year. Also because there are 9 Section 232 investigations currently underway. Those are sector-specific tariffs on everything from trucks to rare earths, semiconductors, products that go into solar cells, and of course copper and lumber, which were the first two to go underway. And we have a lot of those in our forecast. Our own forecast is that the effective tariff rate climbs from where it is today, around 9 to 10%, to potentially double that by the end of the year.
I'm also wondering what you're telling clients who are asking you about the potential inflationary impacts when it comes to tariffs. What sort of timelines are you forecasting when you're running the numbers, particularly as we do see these tariff rates shifting on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, there is a lag on when the effects of tariff actually hit the economy, really 6 to 18 months, according to the literature. So even if we assume that it's a lot faster this time around due to enforcement, we're still on the early end of that timeline for some of the first tariffs that were signed into law. And so I don't think the inflationary impacts have been fully felt, but also the impacts on demand as well, and a slowdown in consumption, potentially also margin compression for firms, and then potential layoffs. That's really the core of the debate, I think, at the Federal Reserve right now, is which one wins out. Is it the hit to demand via margin compression or layoffs, or is it the inflation? Now, timing-wise, we think the inflation might hit first over the fall and winter potentially, and that's why we think the Fed is going to hold off for some time, although it will be hotly debated, I think, over the next couple of months whether or not they should cut rates.
Megan, thank you so much. It's great to have you with us. Megan Schoenberger, senior economist, KPMG, with us on Balance of Power. Thank you. Coming up, President Trump says he has not considered pardoning convicted sex offender Ghislaine Maxwell, but that he could if he wanted to. We'll discuss how the presidential power could impact the release of the Epstein files when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. We'll continue the conversation on the politics surrounding the Epstein files when we assemble our political panel. But first, the stories we're following in today's Power Brief. Cornell University may be the next school to strike a deal with the Trump administration to reinstate hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding that was pulled because of allegations of anti-Semitism. The deal is expected to include a cash fine for civil rights violations, as well as a wide set of policy reforms. On Wednesday, Columbia University became the first school to reach an agreement with the government. A White House source telling Bloomberg that Brown University and Northwestern University, are also close to striking similar deals.
And the U.S. government is now deporting detainees from the makeshift immigration detention center in Florida that has been dubbed Alligator Alcatraz. Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis says about 100 people were deported directly from the facility, although he declined to say where they were being sent. The facility was quickly set up in late June and was toured by President Trump before opening this month. Last week, a group of detainees sued federal and state officials and agencies, claiming the center has no procedure for migrants to contact their lawyers. And
President Trump has arrived in Scotland for a 5-day visit for what the White House is calling a working trip. In addition to trade talks with leaders from the EU and UK, the president is expected to hit the links. He'll be staying at his Turnberry Golf Resort on Scotland's northeastern coast for the first part of the trip. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, we're looking at images of security ramping up around the property ahead of his arrival on both land and sea. President Trump will also visit his family's newest golf course near the city of Aberdeen ahead of its official opening next month. Authorities across the country are preparing for protests throughout his stay.
For more on this story and more, joining us now with their reaction is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Rick, I want to start with you because there's a lot of expectations going into this meeting this weekend between President Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, and there's pretty high stakes. The EU would face a 30% tariff if they don't make a deal with the U.S. what should we be expecting here? Could President Trump actually pull the trigger on a rate that high? Since earlier today he said it was a 50-50 chance they actually get an agreement.
Well, if they don't get an agreement, he will pull the trigger on a rate that high, because that is how he's demonstrated his negotiating tactics with virtually every country that's been in some kind of a negotiation with him. But that being said, I think the Europeans are very smart about what they're trying to accomplish here. And I think that there's more likely a chance that there's some framework that gets organized around more minimum basic tariffs that we've seen in places like Japan and other countries. If anything, we'll also see him meet with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who is set as the model of getting deals done with Donald Trump so far. So I think there's a lot that they've learned from what he's been able to accomplish already.
We'll see if that includes rolling out the red carpet the way Keir Starmer did when he came for the big visit. Jeannie, are we getting beyond ourselves here when it comes to expectations for a deal with the EU? August 1st is a week from today. What's going to happen the next week?
It's going to be fascinating because, as we just heard from Japan today, they are saying, wait a minute, not so fast. And we had Donald Trump saying before he left for Scotland, 50-50 chance, as Tyler said, they've got to buy down from that 30%. And we hear from Japan this model of a deal. We're told by the administration that they are in two different universes when it comes to that buy down fund. So what this all means is going to be fascinating because, unlike Japan, the EU is 27 countries, and dealing with a confederation is vastly different than dealing with one nation. They're both hard, but in this case, you've got to get 27 different nations to come on board. And if they can't do that by the 1st, and Donald Trump pulls the trigger, and he might do that, they're prepared apparently to retaliate on the 7th. And so the losers in all of this will be the American public that eventually will be paying for these tariffs, because despite what the president says, these are tariffs that we pay, not foreign countries.
Well, President Trump also often says that his tariff plans would go hand in hand with lower interest rates. And of course, the scrutiny, the criticism of the Federal Reserve was on full display this week when President Trump visited the renovation site of the Fed's headquarters here in Washington. We want to play you guys some of this exchange between President Trump and Fed Chair Jerome Powell when he visited over there yesterday.
It looks like it's about $3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed. You're including the Martin renovation. You just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building.
Well, no, but it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work.
But it's not new.
They're, of course, talking about the costs for the renovation at the Federal Reserve in downtown Washington. So, Rick, President Trump also went on to say that he doesn't have plans or intentions to fire Powell. He's going to let him serve out his term until May of 2026. So what's the point of the optics here? If it's not to fire Powell, what's the president's ultimate goal?
Yeah, look, I mean, the president is a master marketeer, right? And the fact that he's not firing him is a bit of a concession for Donald Trump. So what is he going to get out of that concession? He's going to go beat him up on cost overruns. He's going to beat him up on the timing of the rate cuts. I mean, like, at the end of the day, I agree with what Marc Short said earlier on this program. There's really no downside to Donald Trump to these theatrics, right? Sooner or later, Powell will be gone. Sooner or later, rates will come down, and he'll declare victory on both. So all he has to do is sort of fill the gap. And today, this week's visit to a construction site that literally could have been a Saturday Night Live routine is just filling that time frame.
Just waiting for the cold open whenever they're live again. I felt like I was watching an episode of The Apprentice, Jeannie. Nobody got fired on this one, though. Do you see this the same way? And maybe we'll extend this a little bit further. Are Donald Trump and Jay Powell going to become friends next?
Oh, I'm not sure. I just can watch over and over again Jerome Powell shaking his head as Donald Trump pulls that letter out. It is a perfect moment. I do think it is right strategically that there is no downside here for Donald Trump. But I want to give kudos to Jerome Powell, because unlike somebody like Christopher Wray, who under pressure earlier this year from Donald Trump did resign, saying that would be the path forward to keeping the FBI above the political political fray. Jerome Powell, as of yet, is not taking that path. I thought Christopher Wray was dead wrong about that. You just embed them more into the political fray when you accept Donald Trump's push and you get yourself out. So kudos to Jerome Powell for sticking with it. The independence of the Fed is critical for all of us. So I think he should be celebrated for that. He's going to know that he's going to be a punching bag depending on what happens with interest rates next week, certainly, and going forward, because he is a perfect person for Donald Trump to blame, since Joe Biden isn't here to kick around anymore.
Well, another story that really dominated the headlines this week that we want to get to, of course, has to do with Jeffrey Epstein. And today, President Trump shared whether or not he had considered a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell.
Would you consider a pardon or a commutation for Ghislaine Maxwell if she's cooperating?
It's something I haven't thought about. It's really something.
Recommended it.
It's something I'm allowed to do it, but it's something I have not thought about.
But you wouldn't rule it out, sir?
Rick, we've been having this conversation here. There's this polling out from the Wall Street Journal showing that President Trump has really solid support when it comes to his base. But then we're seeing other polling that shows that Republicans aren't too happy with how he's been handling this issue. 64% of Republican voters say they think the DOJ is hiding something, according to this recent Wall Street Journal poll. Does this have the potential to fracture the base that has been pretty solidly behind the president?
Well, I cannot imagine a scenario that Ms. Maxwell has any information that is going to be so noteworthy that's going to result in the president getting excited about releasing from a 20-year prison sentence the business partner and friend of Jeffrey Epstein at a time when his base is saying that he's not doing enough to prosecute the Epstein case. Can you imagine the reaction of the MAGA base when he lets go a trafficker of young women and somebody who has tolerated sex abuse? I mean, it would be a death knell. I mean, you're right. The support that he has on this in his base is half of what he has in any other issue that he's currently prosecuting as president. So as he is doing today, tread lightly on this, Mr. President. It is a dangerous act to play.
Jeannie, we've only got about a minute. What would happen if Donald Trump pardoned Maxwell?
It's absolutely unconscionable, even the thought of it. This is somebody who was found guilty of abuse and trafficking of underage girls, aiding and abetting one of the most notorious pedophiles in American history. The idea that the president would even consider it, the thing he should consider is release the Epstein files. Even Bill Clinton said today, release the files. So release them, Mr. President, but don't release the woman found guilty of aiding and abetting the pedophile. That is insanity and unconscionable. And if he does it, the pushback would be enormous.
I think they agree. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, many thanks. Great insights. I hope you both have a great weekend. Hope you do, too. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us today on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Tyler Kendall. We'll see you on Monday.